Hi, welcome back to another rabbit hole. I'm so beastly tired of mankind and the world that nothing can interest me unless it contains a couple of murders on each page or details with the horrors unnameable and unaccountable that leer down from the external universes. The world is indeed comic, but the joke is on mankind. The voice behind these passages and the subject of this rabbit hole is, of course, H.P. Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft, or Howard Phillips Lovecraft, was born in 1890 in Providence, Rhode Island, in the United States. He was a writer of horror and science fiction stories and novels, specifically the genre known as cosmic horror. H.P. Lovecraft has cultivated a devoted following and has a massive fan base, though he also has his detractors, considered by many to be the literary successor to Edgar Allan Poe. He did not achieve recognition as a literary emblem until after his death. As Michel Houellebecq puts it, H.P. Lovecraft had to die for his work to be born. And I certainly experience cosmic horror, but not because of the stories themselves. I actually really enjoy the genre, but because as a Latina, the texts are really difficult to enjoy, and you'll understand soon why. This won't be a perfect video, nor the ultimate guide to H.P. Lovecraft, but join me as I explore what I could uncover about this author, a subject that is honestly too vast for any single person with limited time to fully grasp. Please keep in mind that this reflects my personal experience and biases. There is no such a thing as an objective rabbit hole because I choose the direction of the topics I want to delve into. I'm always open to comments and discussions, but I'm doing this entirely on my own, reading, researching, writing the script, filming and editing, and still learning the rhythm of this type of content. And I'm also terrified to my bones about posting this type of videos. I'm an anxious and depressed person. I know I'm in therapy, I have a psychiatrist, I'm medicated, I'm doing fine, but please be kind in the comments. And also, just a little reminder, I'm a Spanish speaker, and these letters contain really heavy and charged language, so I will bleep some words. But if I fail to do so with a word, please understand English is not my native language and I might miss something, and I mean no harm, offense, or I don't have any ill intent with it. So, down the rabbit hole we go. Let's start by exploring his origins, the social context, and his beginnings in literature, though I probably won't cover absolutely everything, otherwise this video would be 8 hours long. But let's go with a brief biography. Spoiler, nothing about this video will be brief, but join me, it's going to be interesting. His family had once belonged to the Anglo-Saxon upper class, and although their economic status gradually declined, the idea of belonging to a privileged elite never left his mother, nor Lovecraft himself. His father spent 5 years institutionalized following a nervous breakdown and ultimately died in 1898, when Lovecraft was still a child. Faced with this early loss, his mother became overprotective and instilled in him a deep fear of anything and anyone who was different. They lived with their aunts, Lillian and Annie, and their maternal grandfather, Whipple Van Buren Phillips. It was precisely his grandfather who introduced Lovecraft to the world of literature because he had a vast library. The psychiatrist and essay writer Rafael Lopez wrote of the author, "Raised with a holy dread of human race, with the exception of good families or Anglo-Saxon origins, he believed that no one is capable of understanding or loving another, and he felt like a foreigner in his own land." A paradox runs through his lifetime. On the one hand, he was a child prodigy. On the other, his formal education was highly inconsistent, and he never completed his studies. Yet, in his letters, he frequently discussed the upbringing of the so-called upper classes, that is his own. He abandoned his studies during his teenage years due to severe depressive episodes, which would strongly define his life and his writing. Although Lovecraft began writing poetry at just 7 years old and wrote a few articles during his teens, it was not until 1908 that he started writing articles regularly for various magazines. In 1914, he was invited to join the United Amateur Press Association, WAPA, a group of amateur press writers from across the country who produced and published their own magazines. In addition to writing prolifically for other publications, he created his own magazine, The Conservative, releasing 13 numbers in total between 1915 and 1923. Later on, Lovecraft became president and official editor of the WAPA and also briefly assumed the presidency of the rival organization, the National Amateur Press Association, that is NAPA. In his words, Lovecraft said, "In 1914, when the friendly hand of the amateur press world was first extended to me, I was as close to a vegetative state as any animal could be. With the advent of the WAPA, I gained a renewed vital impulse, a fresh sense of existence, no longer as a superfluous burden, and found a sphere where I could feel that my efforts were not entirely futile. For the first time, I could imagine that my clumsy artistic attempts were something more than feeble cries lost in a world that was not listening." Although he had written a few stories previously, it was from 1917 onwards that he began writing fiction profusely. Stories linked to the strange dreams and nightmares he experienced every time he would close his eyes. Lovecraft also worked as a ghostwriter for other authors, such as Harry Houdini, a topic that would be a rabbit hole in itself, William Lumley, Celia Brown Bishop, among others. His mother died in 1921, and grief affected him deeply. Later, he met the writer and business owner Sonia Green, the first and only woman with him who became romantically involved. Of course, she was the one who made the first move, and the detail that is important for what is to come is that she was Jewish. The couple married and moved to New York for work, but the marriage ended after a few years. Lovecraft eventually returned to Providence, his native city, where he lived for the rest of his short life. He actually passed away at the young age of 46 years old. Let's put a pin in his time in New York, as it is crucial to the story I'm about to tell in this video. He had a really complex love love-hate relationship with the city, and believe me, he will make that known. Let's start breaking down the topics I want to cover in this video. And first, of course, we have to talk about his work. The first thing I did before knowing anything of what I just told you about him was to read his short stories and his novels. I did the thing. And here's a list of the stories I read: The Call of Cthulhu, The Dunwich Horror, At the Mountains of Madness, Polaris, The Street, Ex Oblivione, The Color Out of Space, The Descendant, which is an unfinished story, but that it's quite interesting, and The Unnameable. I did this because I originally intended to do a video about his work. In some of my Spanish videos, I mentioned that I'm watching some vintage movies, and I'm especially hooked in a lot of film noir and old terror starring Vincent Price. So when I felt the urge to go back into reading, partly because I was spiraling into anxiety over the news, it seemed natural for me to choose Lovecraft. I had never read his work before, but I knew he was the horror writer of the early 20th century. And to be honest, it wasn't the purely pleasurable, anxiety-soothing experience I had expected. There were moments of enjoyment, certainly maybe in one of the stories, but mostly a deep sense of uneasiness began to boil in my body. You see, I'm Argentinian, that is Latin American. While there is much to be said about the numerous generations of us who are descendants from European immigrants, particularly from Italy and Spain, and the extermination of our native population, I am Latin American. I was born, raised, educated, and still live in a Latin American country with all its beauty and our profound pains. Almost as soon as I started reading Lovecraft, I couldn't help but notice a pattern in the conflicts he presents. The protagonist is always white, while the antagonist is native, black, or mestizo, and also somewhat an alien. The white protagonist feels fear and horror toward what the antagonist represents. That is, barbarism, paganism, savagery, cruelty, evil, immorality, and disharmony. We are the worst of the worst. And yeah, I say we because that's how it made me feel. He made me feel like I was one of the people he hated. And that was the start of the rabbit hole for me. And I open a new tab here. I was researching for so much material for this video that I stumbled upon a book by Michel Houellebecq. If you are looking for an analysis of his work, focusing on literature and stylistic devices, and honestly that gives him more praise than I will do in this video, I recommend reading the essay H.P. Lovecraft Against the World, Against Life, which features a prologue by Stephen King. This was the next read in my quest to understanding more about the author. And Stephen King opens the book by describing Michel's essay as an extraordinary blend of empathetic biography, insightful criticism, and fervent advocacy, a sort of erudite declaration of love. To briefly summarize the essay, Houellebecq highlights some of the writer's great virtues and unique qualities, traits that the authors have tried to emulate, but in his views have failed to capture successfully. That is, his ability to create mythologies later used by other authors to create what is known as a foundational myth, upon which other writers like Robert T. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, and Robert W. Chambers would build upon, which is something no one can debate. Also, he appreciates the way the author approaches his stories without providing context regarding his characters' daily lives or details that could be familiar to the average American, which contributes to what many describe as the timelessness of Lovecraft's work, rooted in its existential nature. I would kindly disagree with this, and some huge authors will do that later on in this video, and their opinions hold more weight than mine, but that's coming. Then points out and discusses the absence of explicit references to money or sex, themes that were quite prominent in the literature in this period, and his ability instead to evoke a sense of fascination. He deems the incorporation of scientific language as something novel, his construction of dreamlike, gothic, non-rooted in reality architecture, and the precision of the soundscapes within his texts. The essay also talks about his time in New York and his racism. There is an appreciation for Lovecraft's authenticity, something perhaps easier to do for a French person than for a Latin American woman to acknowledge. He essentially frames this, by this I mean his racism, as a part of a broader hatred for humanity, concluding that Lovecraft would loathe the current political, economic, and social landscape. And the only good thing I can point out about Houellebecq's book is that he sent me into this spiral by mentioning that Lovecraft wrote numerous letters every day, and he quotes a few excerpts. And let's put a pin in this. We'll come back to the subject of the letters later on. Cries in controversies. A brief departure to mention that Michel Houellebecq apparently holds some rather questionable beliefs and has made some controversial statements. If you'd like me to go on a rabbit hole on him, I might consider it. I've only read 2 of his books, though, so it would require quite a bit of research, but I could. I'm not saying I will, but I could. But yeah, no wonder his analysis rubbed me the wrong way, and just wanted to say that. But let's go back to the start of the rabbit hole and what troubled me about these readings. I have some passages here I'd like to read to you so that you understand where I'm coming from. If you never read Lovecraft, I won't be able to recount the plot of every text. I just want to note the descriptors he uses. In the Call of Cthulhu, I'm not pronouncing it right or wrong. There is no right or wrong way to pronounce these names. They were specifically invented to not be able to be pronounced by humans. So, just that. There is a folder containing many press clippings collected by Professor Angle about strange incidents that occurred over a specific period, and one passage reads, "Here was a nocturnal suicide in London, where a lone sleeper had leaped from a window after a shocking cry. Here, likewise, a rambling letter to the editor of a paper in South America, where a fanatic deduces a dire future from visions he has seen. A dispatch from California describes a theosophist colony as donning white robes in mass for some glorious fulfillment which never arrives, whilst items from India speak guardedly of serious native unrest towards the end of March. Voodoo orgies multiply in Haiti, and African outposts report ominous mutterings. American officers in the Philippines find certain tribes bothersome about this time, and New York policemen are mobbed by hysterical Levantines on the 9th of March 2223. So, let's look at the bingo card of prejudices against anyone that is different. South American, check. Central American, check. Africans, check. People with esoteric beliefs, check. Mediterranean natives, check. Could not help to realize that none of these people or communities going through this sort of collective psychosis is a white Anglo-Saxon man. And that was the first thing that really struck me. Later on, it says, the region now entered by police was one of traditionally evil repute, substantially unknown and untraversed by white men. There were legends of a hidden lake unglimpsed by mortal sight, in which dwelt a huge, formless, white polypous thing with luminous eyes, and squatters whispered that bat-winged devils flew out of caverns in inner earth to worship it at midnight. They said it had been there before D'Urville, before Lesage, before the Indians, and before even the wholesome beasts and birds of the woods. It was nightmare itself, and to see it was to die. But it made men dream, and so they knew enough to keep away. The present voodoo orgy was indeed on the merest fringe of its abhorred area, but that location was bad enough. Hence, perhaps, the very place of the worship had terrified the squatters more than the shocking sounds and incidents. Again, this idea of orgies, excesses, and horror, on top of that language indicating that America needed to be discovered, explored by white men for it to exist. In the Dunwich Horror, he writes, perhaps one reason, though it cannot apply to uninformed strangers, is that the natives are now repellently decadent, having gone far along that path of retrogression so common in many New England backwaters. They have come to form a race by themselves with the well-defined mental and physical stigmata of degeneracy and inbreeding. The average of their intelligence is woefully low, whilst their anal reek of over-viciousness and half-hidden murders, incests, and deeds of almost unnameable violence and perversity. The old gentry, representing the 2 or 3 armigerous families which came to Salem in 1692, have kept somewhat above the general level of decay, though many branches are sunk into the sordid populace so deeply that only their names remain as a key to the origin they disgrace. Some of the Whitleys and bishops still send their eldest sons to Harvard and Miskatonic, though those sons seldom return to the moldering rumble roof under which they and their ancestors were born. Later on, he makes this description. His facial aspect, too, was remarkable for its maturity, for though he shared his mother's and grandfather's chinlessness, his firm and precociously shaped nose united with the expression of his large, dark, almost Latin eyes to give him an air of quasi-adulthood and well-nigh preternatural intelligence. He was, however, exceedingly ugly despite his appearance of brilliancy, there being something almost goatish or animalistic about his thick lips, large port, yellowish skin, coarse, crinkly hair, and oddly elongated ears. You are the ugly one, Lovecraft, and I'm not talking about your physics. Then, in the streets, there are passages like this. Men of strength and honor fashioned that street, good, valiant man of our blood, who had come from the blessed isles across the sea. At first, it was but a path trodden by bearers of water from the woodland spring to the cluster of houses by the beach. Then, as more men came to the growing cluster of houses and looked about for places to dwell, they built cabins along the north side, cabins of stout oaken logs with masonry on the side towards the forest, for many Indians lurked there with fire arrows. And also like this. There was war, and thereafter no more Indians traveled the street. And also like this. The rumor now spread widely that these houses contained the leaders of a vast band of terrorists who on a designated day were to launch an orgy of slaughter for the extermination of America and all of the fine old traditions which the street had loved. Handbills and papers fluttered about filthy gutters, handbills and papers printed in many tongues and in many characters, yet all bearing messages of crime and rebellion. In these writings, the people were urged to tear down the laws and virtues that our fathers had exalted, to stamp out the soul of the old America, the soul that was bequeathed through 1,500 years of Anglo-Saxon freedom, justice, and moderation. It was said that the swart men who dwelt in the street and congregated in its rooting edifices were the brains of a hideous revolution, that at the word of a command, many millions of brainless, besotted beasts would stretch forth their noisome talons from the slums of 1,000 cities, burning, slaying, and destroying till the land of our fathers should be no more. These are just a few of the many passages I marked. The issue here becomes a lot messy and a lot complex. On one hand, Lovecraft is a man filled with fears stemming from his upbringing. The unknown terrifies him and fuels his nightmares, and he loathes the foreigner, which is precisely what feeds his stories. And many firm defendants of the author will argue that he was simply a product of his time, but no, he was not. On the other hand, what emerges from his letters and what I came to realize is that he was a man who stayed informed, read widely, and devoted mental energy to analyzing the world around him. And that is the point where, for me, justifying him becomes impossible. I was not trying to justify him. I have no interest in doing so. But his letters confirmed everything I had begun to suspect. Regarding drawing inspiration from dreams for one writing, Borges makes an interesting point in an interview with Willis Barnstone, which I will read. Barnstone asks Borges about borrowing inspiration from dreams as a literary resource. And Borges says, "Yes, it is. From Quincy and so on. There is a fine literary tradition to that. The Quincy must have worked out his nightmares when he wrote them down, right? Because they are so fine. Besides, they depend on words also, while nightmares generally don't depend on words. What's difficult about writing a nightmare is that the nightmare feeling does not come from the images. Rather, As Coleridge said, the feeling gives you the images. And Barstone responds, that's a major distinction because most people think the opposite. They don't think it all through. And Borges, lovely, responds, when you write down the images, those images may not mean anything to you. It's what you get in the case of Poe or Lovecraft. The images are awful, but the feeling isn't awful. And I fully agree. I mean, it is Borges. How can you not agree? As I was saying, these stories didn't fill me with dread, nor did they deepen the existential dilemmas I already live with as someone with anxiety and depression. Perhaps the fact that we live in an increasingly dystopian society plays a role in this, but the course of cosmic horror didn't take hold of me. What did begin to unsettle me instead were the cruel descriptions of anyone who wasn't a white Anglo-Saxon man. Before tackling his letters, I want to briefly discuss the context for marginalized immigrant communities in the United States at that time. Please forgive me for not going into exhaustive detail. This struggle extends to the present days and is marked by so many events that it is impossible to cover absolutely everything. However, in 1831 is considered the birth of the abolitionist movement. From the early 1600s, with the arrival of slave ships, the enslavement of African communities, primarily for labor on plantations in the South, was the norm. Yet, between 1831 and 1865, numerous rebellions took place, that is, social, legal, and very bloody, in the fight for the emancipation of enslaved people. In late 1865, the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution was ratified, definitely prohibiting slavery and involuntary servitude throughout the country. At the time of its ratification, slavery remained legal in some states, even though enslaved people in the rest of the US had already been freed through state action and the federal government's Emancipation Proclamation. Consequently, thousands of enslaved people were liberated. Did this mark the end of racism and segregation? No, of course not, which is why movements like Black Lives Matter exist today. However, it is crucial to understand what follows, to recognize that at that time, slavery was no longer legal, and the moral and ethical reevaluation of the practice and about racism as a whole had already been taking place. The situation for native indigenous communities was, as you can imagine, no better. To brutally condense the history of an entire continent, the arrival of colonizing expeditions caused the ethnocide and genocide of our native populations. This meant massacres, slavery, forced labor, executions of those who chose to practice traditional rituals that did not align with Franciscan evangelization, the forced displacement from their territories and deportations to the Caribbean, and the introduction of new diseases causing epidemics that wrecked these communities. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was established in 1824. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act inaugurated a policy of displacing indigenous populations even further westward. The president at that time, Andrew Jackson, pushed through a law deporting Native Americans from the east of the Mississippi to the west of the river, primarily to Oklahoma, in order to exploit gold mines discovered in their territories and to settle immigrants arriving from Europe. This law was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court and sparked wars with the Cherokee that lasted until 1838. By 1850, approximately 100,000 Native Americans had been deported. The most infamous episode remains the Trail of Tears. This forced deportation claimed at least 4,000 lives due to cold, disease, and exhaustion. It was not until the early 20th century that the US government acknowledged the inequality and racism affecting the indigenous minority. Citizenship, and with it the right to vote, was granted in 1924 in recognition of the contributions made by these Indian populations, in particular during World War I. So, great, the USA sends them to war, and as a thank you card, they give them citizenship. The cruelty inflicted upon our native communities over the century has been brutal, and we should be profoundly ashamed of it. I'm going to weave in important historical details in between the letters. Otherwise, I'd go on forever, and I really want to dive into the subject itself. So I started Googling in search of his letters because, as you might have noticed from the Lewis Carroll video, I'm fascinated by this author's correspondence, the writing beyond the writing. In Lovecraft's case, these letters are actually really lengthy essays that are even considered a form of epistolary literature. And while I was researching, expecting to find 8-10 letters, well, I actually discovered that this man wrote approximately 85,000 letters. Of those, roughly 3,500 have been published chronologically across several volumes, and curiosity can take you places. I managed to find several volumes of his correspondence in English. Obviously, I couldn't read them all. We are talking about 3,500 letters, some of which, as I mentioned, are as long as essays. But I read and listened to about 30 letters he wrote. I encountered some in text form and others by a podcast called Voluminous, where they read and analyze Lovecraft's letters. Sadly, the podcast is no longer active, but there are plenty of episodes available on Spotify, and they are a real gem. And let me tell you, these letters are far more raw, cruel, and unfiltered than his stories. And I think they'll help us understand Lovecraft's worldview much better. Are you ready to hear me read a lot of letters? I hope so, because oh boy, do I have material. I put a small selection that illustrates the full problematic checklist of Lovecraft's views. But believe me that unless the correspondence was strictly work-related, there's something worth pointing out in almost all of them. This man was a hate-spewing machine. In a letter to F.C. Clarke, one of his aunts, from 1925, he writes, "It'll be hard to shelve the gang, but with tact, I'm certainly doing it. Just now, my prime difficulty is how to not offend Loveman by refusing his proposition for a Philadelphia excursion some Sunday soon. He wants to see the colonial part of the town and wishes my services as a guide, eager to pay my fare at the special excursion rate of $3. Now, if I had the money, I'd be glad enough of the trip. Heaven knows I want to see a real white man's town badly enough, but unless I pay my own fare, there will be an unescapable atmosphere of obligation which will lessen my sense of independence and breaking free. At the time he wrote this letter, Lovecraft was living in New York, a city where a large portion of its population consisted of immigrants. According to Ancestry.com, Russian Jews made up the largest immigrant group in New York. However, there had also been a massive influx of African Americans who filled the city with dance, music, art, literature, fashion, theater, and politics, particularly in Harlem. And as we've come to know, these were some of the communities Lovecraft hated the most: the Jewish and African American communities. Lovecraft was essentially a recluse, so the only thing that appealed to him about such a trip was the prospect of visiting a city of white people. In a letter to James F. Morton in 1926, following his return to Providence, fleeing the city of his nightmares, he says, "I kept Hobhouse out to read on the train during my journey home, but was so engrossed by the emotions of reawakening life at the sight of New England that I could not, after all, though awed by gaze out the windows at stone walls, rolling pastures, and white church steeples, imagining them when none were in sight. It is astonishing how much better the old head works since its restoration to those native scenes amidst which I belong. As my exile progressed, even reading and writing became relatively slow and formidable processes, so that my epistles were exceedingly brief and labored efforts. Now I find something of my antique Providence fluency returning by degrees, and I have been able to keep my correspondence in manageable shape without more than a fraction of the effort which I was forced to expend when engulfed in the nightmare of Brooklyn's slums." At the end of this letter, a word is used, one I had to look up, that is a highly derogatory and racist term. It is very specific to the United States and really outdated too, which is why I wasn't familiar with it. As you may or may not know, I'm a Spanish speaker, so I don't know a lot of slurs. I want to read the letters as candidly as I can without any offense or ill intent. But again, the racism, the hatred of diversity, in opposition to his ideal of homogeneity and purity, are alarming. In a letter to Frank Belknap Long, also from 1926, written from Providence, he decides to talk about another of the communities that he detested, and he says, "I am not prepared to admit that the essentially exotic and oriental culture stream of the Hebraic tradition has any legitimate place in a Western and Aryan civilization. We can gradually absorb such Jewish elements as are dominantly Nordic or even Mediterranean in their biological composition, kin, gray-eyed, white-skinned German Jews like the first August Belmont or ascetic Portuguese Jewish types, like those whose blood has already tinctured to a great extent the body of the Spanish people. But this absorption absolutely postulates a complete cultural surrender of their part and acceptance of our own Aryan point of view, loyalties, religion, and heritage. In other words, they must throw themselves wholly into the mainstream and utterly forget their own individual past. Else they will engender unpleasant cross-currents of taste and feeling which will continue to make them socially distasteful. Later he says, Aryans, as Aryans, will always feel a deep-seated and uneasy dislike towards Jews, as Jews, and the introduction of a large Jewish element into the social, intellectual, and aesthetic life of a community can only result in the maintenance of two separate streams without contact. People who have heard different songs crooned over their cradles will sing different songs when their time of singing comes. And this, we must note very carefully, applies to the best type of Jews as well as to their hopeless riffraff. Fine learning, even fine race talk there may be, but as long as a cultural group looks back to sources utterly loathsome to our own aesthetic schemes, we will always detest them. So I say that whilst it is eminently desirable to salvage good Jewish race stock by very gradual absorption into the Aryan and dominating body, it is absolutely necessary that this salvaging be accompanied by a total effacement of the newcomers' traditions. They must suffer a complete intellectual and aesthetic amnesia and join us as Aryans when they do join. He finishes by saying, to the Jew we must say, live your own life, here or elsewhere, but remember that you live among Aryans who are not to be disturbed. This letter is so shocking. In the 1850s, the writer, French writer, Arthur de Gobineau, adopted the term Aryan as a racial category. He wrote an essay on the inequality of the human races in 1853. He is considered the father of racial demography, and his works were amongst the earliest examples of scientific racism. Through the writings of Houston Stewart Chamberlain, Gobineau's ideas later influenced Nazi racial ideology, and while I haven't found any explicit reference indicating that Lovecraft actually read Gobineau, theories maintain that he almost certainly did. What this letter demonstrates is that Lovecraft was well aware of the theories of the time championed by various philosophers and thinkers. Therefore, we cannot attribute his views to ignorance. There was genuine conviction here, an informed and voluntary alignment with these ideas. So much so that, again, despite the lack of an explicit record, years later his wife Sonia Green, who was Jewish, it should be noted, stated in her memoirs that Lovecraft read an English translation as soon as it became available in 1933. In other words, these were convictions he held for decades, even though anti-Semitism and racism were already being condemned by the time. Did such things still happen? Yeah, of course, they persist to this day. And obviously, with Hitler's rise to power in the 1930s, they were taken to the absolute extreme as a state policy. Yet, as early as 1926, when this letter was written, debates regarding racism, anti-Semitism, and segregation had already been ongoing for decades. In a letter to James F. M. Morton, also from 1926, he says, "Only a damn fool can expect the people of one tradition to feel at case when their country is flooded with hordes of foreigners who, whether equal, superior, or inferior biologically, are so antipodal in physical, emotional, and intellectual makeup that harmonious coalescence is virtually impossible. Such an immigration is death to all endurable existence, and pollution and decay to all art and culture. To permit or encourage it is suicide, as you can clearly see in that hell called New York, where a chaos of scum has raised a stench intolerable to any self-respecting white man." Lovecraft, hatred or racism, was both biological and cultural. He believed in his own racial and cultural superiority, yet this also brought to mind what Houellebecq said, that Lovecraft never spoke about money. The fact is, Lovecraft lived a rather precarious life and died almost in poverty. His sense of superiority was not economic, nor was it measured by success or even education. It was hereditary. It was biological. It was cultural. In a letter to Donald Wandrei from 1927, he says, "New York is dead, and the brilliancy which so impresses one from outside is the phosphorescence of a maggoty corpse. There can be no normal American life or thought in a town full of twisted rat-like vermin from the ghetto and steerage of yesterday, a town where for block on block one can walk without seeing a single face which has any relation to the life and growth of the Nordic Anglo-American stream of civilization." Just a few days later, he writes a letter to Clark Ashton Smith telling him something quite similar. He was apparently a person who ruminated on things. He tells him, "New York belongs to no well-defined fabric and has no place in anyone's hereditary or continuous life, wherefore it is a nursery of pose and pretense rather than of depth and sincerity in art. It is delightful to visit on account of its fairy pinnacles and wealth of museums and the like, but as a place for a white man to live, it simply doesn't exist. The old New York is dead. This one is only a kennel of feverish Again, with this love-hate relationship with New York, he just couldn't shake. I think that for him, New York was the perfect vessel containing the most despicable substance. He liked the shell of New York, but none of what truly makes a city, its people, its diversity, its struggles too. In an endless letter to Mr. Harris in 1929, he unleashes his ultimate hatred: native communities. Like the Indians, they occupy a highly desirable land and prevent civilization from enjoying its benefits, and on account of their material wealth and physical strength, they may yet constitute a genuine menace to the civilized world. Children are always up to mischief, and edged tools and firearms are dangerous in their hands. Real America had the start of a splendid civilization, the British stream, enriched by a geographical setting well calculated to develop a vital, adventurous, and imaginatively fertile existence. What destroyed it as the dominant culture of this continent? Later, he says, the maintenance of that high cultural standard is the only social or political enthusiasm I possess, aside from my constant wish to see the Anglo-Saxon race and psychology remain dominant in America. In effect, I venerate the principle of aristocracy without being specially interested in aristocrats as persons. I don't care who has the dominance, so long as that dominance remains a certain kind of dominance, intellectually and aesthetically considered. It leaves me speechless. Color me shocked? Not. Especially because by that time the Indian Removal Act of 1830 had already been implemented, and by the way, this law was never formally repealed. It remains part of the historical legal record, even though its primary application as an active state policy ended around 1870s. As I said previously, this law had been used to remove indigenous people of their lands in the United States, resulting in massive, brutal expulsions carried out under military command. Not to mention that years later they would be sent to war to fight for the country, as I said previously. Resilience did not originate from the white Anglo-Saxon man, and America was not an empty vessel that needed to be filled with white Anglo-Saxon people. And finally, I want to read you some excerpts from a very long letter to Robert E. Howard from November 1932, which took him 4 days to write. It's going to be a long read, but in this letter he touches upon many topics that I'm interested in discussing. The first excerpt says, "We cannot, in view of what the cultural capacity of mankind has been shown to be, afford to base a civilization on the low cultural standards of an undeveloped majority. Such a civilization of mere working, eating, drinking, breeding, and vacantly loafing or childishly playing isn't worth maintaining. None of the members of it are really better off than as if they didn't exist at all, and those who are either exceptionally sensitive or exceptionally superior or both are infinitely worse off than as if they didn't exist. To be more specific, the process of being alive and conscious is too intrinsically painful, too predominantly painful after all allowances for natural pleasure are made, to make it worth enduring by any man who has lost the primitive zest of savagery, unless he has a chance of enlarging his grasp on life by a mental and aesthetic development much greater than that of the undeveloped majority. No settled, civilized group has any reason to exist unless it can develop a decently high degree of intellectual and artistic cultivation. Even at the cost of a little limitation of privilege here and there, we must give the real natural capacity of the best of the group a chance to show what they can do toward dispelling the horror and the weariness of the undeveloped consciousness. But remember that this isn't blindly subscribing to any traditional aristocratic or plutocratic system. What is needed is simply a system which will enable at least some persons, as many as possible, to develop their potentialities to enough to an extent to make life worth living, and which will sustain an environment in which such developed personalities can function with a minimum of pain and disharmony. This is essentially social Darwinism, a concept primarily associated with the ideas of Herbert Spencer, as well as later reinterpretations of evolutionary theory within social and political contexts. These pseudo-scientific interpretations link evolutionary processes to the development of human societies and have been used egregiously to justify forms of competition among individuals, social groups, nations, or races. Historically, the term has been linked to movements such as eugenics, scientific racism, and various forms of imperialism. These pseudo-theories took firm hold in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a fact that further reinforces that Lovecraft was neither uninformed nor isolated from the events and theories of his time. So he should know that racism is bad. Then he decides to talk about slavery because why not? And he says, as for peonage or actual slavery, that is hardly a practical possibility, except for inferior or badly cowed race dogs. The whole psychological equilibrium which made it possible in medieval and ancient times has been permanently destroyed. But it really wouldn't be so bad to enslave black people, Mexicans, and certain types of biologically backward foreign peasants. I'm no abolitionist. In fact, I probably had been almost ostracized in New England in the hectic days of Charles Sumner, Wendell Phillips, and Bostonese Pharisaisms in general. Of course, slavery ought to be regulated by stringent laws as to the treatment of slaves, laws backed up by frequent governmental inspections and sustained by a carefully directed public sentiment as to humane conditions. In the 18th century, when we had Negro slaves in Rhode Island, there was never any discontent or talk of ill treatment. On the large estates of Kings County, the blacks were in general simply contented, having their own festivities and indulging in a kind of annual Saturnalia in which large numbers met and elected one of their number King of Africa for the ensuing year. One of my ancestors, Robert Hazard, left 133 slaves in his will. What caused slavery to decline in the North was the complex economic readjustment which rendered large-scale agriculture and stock raising no longer as profitable as maritime commerce, when it no longer paid to keep began to have moral and religious scruples about the matter, so that around 1800s Rhode Island passed a law limiting slavery to back over 21 and declaring all others and all subsequently born free. Later, this was amended to free the adult Negroes, though most stayed right on with their masters as nominally paid servants. In the next generation, when slavery was defunct in the North, but seen to be still a source of profit in the South, it occurred to Northern politicians to become very quixotic and devoted to the ideal of freedom. Hence, the impassioned, frock-coated moralists of the abolitionist school calling upon heaven to end the outrageous course of human bondage. But on the whole, I don't think slavery would form a practical policy for the future. Psychological conditions have changed. I don't think inferior races or persons of very inferior education or capacity in any race ought to be the political franchise, but I think it is the best public policy to give them as much freedom as is consistent with the maintenance of the civilization of an unimpaired level. Again, slavery was not on the table anymore. It was illegal and it was morally condemned. And then he makes his stance about democracy. This is the last one. Bear with me. Democracy, as distinguished from universal opportunity and good treatment, is today a fallacy, an impossibility so great that any serious attempt to apply it cannot be considered as other than a mockery and a jest. In primitive times, the average man was more or less able to understand the nature of the governmental problems around him, understand that is what immediate measures would best effect his wishes in the long run, and what practical steps would, through a relatively simple chain of cause and effect, be able to ensure the successful adoption and maintenance of such measures. In the involved world of today, no such comprehension is possible under the highly technicalized government which any large industrial nation must have. The citizen of only average information and intelligence can possess only the faintest idea of what the very simplest political principles mean, while he has not the remotest chance of grasping anything whatever about the more advanced and intricate problems of policy and administration. This applies, moreover, not only to the simple and uncultivated man, but to all economic and technical laymen, whether they be plugmen or Sanskrit professors, street sweepers or sculptors. For such uninformed persons to cast votes determining national measures, or even to fancy that they can guess what most of such measures are about, is a subject for uproarious cosmic laughter. A rational fascist government would have to change all that. Both office holding and voting ought to be confined to such persons as can pass a really serious and practical examination in economics, history, sociology, business administration, and other subjects needed for the genuine comprehension of modern governmental problems. But of course, it would be the universally understood duty of the public education system to give everyone, aside perhaps from the members of certain alien race stocks whose heritage makes them unsuitable factors in the management of a nation of the given race stock, an equal opportunity to qualify for the civic franchise. Forgive me for the length of what I've just read to you, but this letter covers so many topics. It touches on the police too, but going into all of it would take forever. But in this letter, he essentially defends slavery, aligns himself with fascist governments, and rejects everything that democracy does, that is, democratizing. While we know democracy has its flaws, being fundamentally opposed to what it stands for, it is the epitome of privilege. And all this coming from someone who, in his lifetime, failed to be a functional human being in any of the respects he so loudly championed. He did not complete his education, held no steady job, and never established the conventional family life he so revered. Furthermore, his family had so badly mismanaged his inheritance that during his marriage with Sonia, it was largely she who supported him financially. The great Lovecraft, living off the earnings of his wife, a woman who was also Jewish. So, Lovecraft, the creator of cosmic horror, a genre that it is supposed to tap into humanity's deepest, most unknown fears. Some theorists describe him as an excellent anthropologist or even a psychologist. In my opinion, he was a person who lived a really small existence, so devoid of affection and real experiences, so full of hate and ignorance, and so trapped inside his own head, so full of shit, that I ended up quite angry. At some point, we have to be able to say he was racist, he was a xenophobe, an anti-Semite, a fascist, he believed in slavery and Aryan superiority, and we shouldn't justify it. Historical context doesn't do it here. Regarding his writing, I'm going to quote a passage from Julio Cortázar. from Notes of the Gothic in the Rio de la Plata, occupying a completely and regrettably opposite position is the work of H.P. Lovecraft, whose prestige has always baffled me. Although he authored one admirable tale, The Color Out of Space, his body of work as a whole suffers from an unacceptably anachronistic vision. Convinced of the validity of his literary effects, Lovecraft is the antithesis of Bram Stoker. He skews any rapport with the reader, seeking instead to induce a hypnotic state using devices that might have been effective in the days of Mrs. Radcliffe but now seem laughable, at least in the Rio de la Plata region. Lovecraft's technique is rudimentary. Before unleashing supernatural or fantastic events, he slowly rises the curtain up on a repetitive, monotonous parade of ominous landscapes, mephitic mists, rising from notorious swamps, cavernous mythologies, and multi-legged creatures from a diabolical realm. Now, if Lovecraft's work were cinematic, I would view it with considerable horror, but as it is written work, the monotonous reiteration of his puerile vocabulary and cliched settings serves only to provoke in me an invincible boredom. And you're right, Julio. There, I said it. I read the whole thing, so you don't have to. If you're a Lovecraft fan, please don't get mad. I try to be fair, but I can only be myself. And after all, this is my rabbit hole. A rabbit hole dug up by Lovecraft himself. And this is it for this rabbit hole. I hope you enjoy it. Please let me know in the comments if you could understand my English, because this is like old English and quite pompous language and I'm not used to that, so I was tripping in my words. I've been filming for 3 hours, so yeah. And please be kind in the comments. I know this is a hard topic. I try to do it with the utmost respect that I can, so yeah. Let me know what you think. I will see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves. Bye.